Hello and welcome back to McClaren Performance for an episode today where I want to talk about what it is to be a top manager. Yes, you have to have that tactical understanding, but I'm talking about the real fundamental qualities that a lot of people don't talk about. With my dad working in football as a manager for as long as he has now, and having worked in football a bit myself now working with managers, I'm starting to develop a bit of an idea of what really makes a good one and what really makes a bad one. And it's so many things that I don't think are mentioned quite a lot. Really, the psychology of a manager. Yes, they have to have that tactical understanding. They have to know how to coach a player. They have to get good performances out of them. But there is so much underlying factors, so many things that actually contribute towards that. And I just want to cover at least 5 of them today, as I think they are really important. And the first thing I want to cover, the one trait that I think a manager should have, is consistency. And what I mean by that is their words, their actions, what they do should always be consistent day in and day out. What it means is that a player can predict exactly what that manager is going to be like, how he would react to certain things. A lot of these points that I make are really going to fall under a theme, and that theme is that when you're a manager, when you're in any workplace, really the top of a hierarchy and people are working under you, you are under a microscope all the time as to what you do and what you say. In football especially though, you're always on the brink of losing respect, and it's something I talked about before. In football and working in football, respect is a big thing where people can look to you and say that that person is reliable, is consistent, knows what they are talking about. And every day is really an effort in some way to maintain that respect, especially as a manager. As soon as you lose that, you don't have those players anymore, they don't perform for you. Anything you really give, it doesn't actually work because those players don't take that on board. They don't believe it's really worth their time. How you maintain that respect in a big way is in that consistency, turning up in the same way, in the same attitude all the time. A manager in a lot of different situations are often losing games, winning games, drawing games, and it's important that a manager keeps a stability. Really, they are the rock of everything else. A player has to look to a manager to see that no matter what is happening, he always has a plan. He's always confident in that plan. He's always working, and he's always working within the process, not being swayed so much by his or her emotions. And one of the things I always like to advise, it's something really big for me, is that your words always have to align with your actions. If you say you're going to do something, you then have to do that and execute that. Any small amount of contradiction in words or actions, it just opens up that little bit of doubt. Players are always looking, and people are always looking for that area of scrutiny, that area in which they can not believe in what you're talking about. It's not very conscious. I think it's very subconscious. I think it's a feeling that a player gets of a manager to the point where they think he's not doing what he's saying he's going to do. What that also means is a consistent philosophy, consistent rules, consistent way of playing. Everything is always wholly consistent values also. It leads into somewhat my second point, the second thing that I like to look for in a manager. A top manager, I think, is someone who is decisive. I think it's better to be either right or wrong than it is to be too late in your decision. It relates somewhat to what I was talking about earlier there, is that it invites some aspect of doubt into what the manager is talking about. It's also important because as a manager, I think sometimes we look from the outside and we see that it's much about working with the players, picking a starting 11, how they were tactically set up. But the realistic thing about management now and has been, I think, for the past few years, especially at the top flight, is that there are a lot of things to do a lot of the time. There's a lot of people to deal with as well and a lot of decisions to make. But what I also mean by decisive is also a kind of simple and honest communication. We talked about Wayne Rooney before, and Dad had worked with him at Derby a little bit. I think one trait that he had and was very good at was being really clear, really simple, really honest in his communication. He could talk to players about the ones he wanted to use. He could talk to players about the ones he wanted to drop. He could talk to staff about how he wanted to use them or not use them. He was very open and honest in that, and everybody was quite straightforward. Everyone really understood exactly what he wanted. And I think that's a very important thing to ultimately get a group of people to align with that. You have to be incredibly open all the time. I think something that I've seen a lot, if you watch Arsenal recently on the documentary that's come out on Amazon Prime, and I think City did one a few years ago as well. It may be something that Arteta has picked up from Pep, but both of them are very quick to open up and apologise and say that they have made mistakes. It's much better to be honest in that rather than lie about that, and then for players to really see those mistakes happening anyway, because then they see a bit of deception, they see a lack of trust with that manager, and ultimately that relationship starts to break down. That simplicity is key also, though. And it's something when I talked about Haaland, something I admired in him. There was that real simplicity in who he was, how he thought, how he acted. And the same thing really can apply to football managers also. And the simple is really important, because if you can have all the tactical genius in the world and you can really understand the game to a real deep level, but the real thing about management, the real thing about coaching, is that you have to communicate that information to a group of players. And the best way to do that is to keep things incredibly simple. What is your style of play? What are your tactics? And can you explain them very simply, maybe even in 3 points? But if you're overcomplicated, if you're contradictory quite a lot of the time, like I say, you'll always gradually lose those players and lose their motivation and lose their want to play for you. This might all sound like really simple stuff, but for me, say if I look at the top 6 managers in the Premier League, I'd imagine these are the traits that these managers probably have, and they have them much better than other managers in the league do. It's what makes a manager very good and very consistently high performing in all of these big teams. And for me, it's something that is much more important than a tactical understanding. Of course, you have to have that as a manager, but a lot of it is to do with the relationships with people. And as I said before, maintaining their respect of you as well. That really leads on to my third point, because I think a manager, a very good manager, should have a really great level of awareness. And that awareness applies at a lot of different levels. For one, you have to have that awareness of the team that you are managing, awareness of their dynamics, awareness of who they are as people, why they do what they do, everything like that. A real understanding, a real finger on the pulse, really, of what is happening within a team or a club. Because if you don't have that, you can't plan for things that might go wrong within the team. And more often than not, these problems would then just come as a surprise. You would not be able to deal with them, and a few weeks later, you get sacked. Because if you don't have that, you can't plan for things that might go wrong within the team. In this case, I've called it awareness, but you can also call it care. You have to have a care for your players, not just for their physical attributes and what they can do on the pitch, but also understand them as a person. Also, it's something we often talk about, the person and the player, and having an understanding of both. Because having that underlying understanding of that player's foundations as a person, you can better predict what they're going to do on the pitch, what mistakes are going to happen, what dramas are going to ensue. And that's not just awareness of the people around you, that is also awareness of yourself, understanding how you think, how you work as a person, understanding your flaws and your strengths, because a lack of awareness of that means that other people can point you out on it. It can become a greater weakness of yours, and it can ultimately undermine you from your job. And like I said, a few weeks later, you get sacked. In life, in everything, whether it's managers or not, just people in general, for me, I can always see a varying degree of that awareness of what's happening around them, or awareness of what is happening to themselves. Another word for awareness also is emotional intelligence. Understanding your own and managing your own emotions, but also understanding and managing the emotions of people around you as well. I think it is ultimately emotional intelligence, a factor that really, I think in research and a lot of things, is really a predictor, or at least correlates with success. When you hear managers talk on, say if they're on a podcast or anything, literally I was listening to Frank Lampard just a moment ago, a lot of them talk about how when people are talking about them on TV and criticising them, they almost don't understand what it is to be a manager and what it is actually like. And I think the points that I've just given really relate a lot to that. I think the criticism on television and other things, they don't come from a place of understanding the real complexities of managing a football team, and ultimately really the deep psychological complexities of doing it, of managing people, of keeping them motivated, keeping them wanting to play for you. That is a large part of the job. I think listening to Frank Lampard just a moment ago saying it is almost 80% of the job, and that's how important it is. I think he's absolutely right. Developing that aspect of yourself is the most important. Again, I go back to Arteta because I was watching that Arsenal documentary. It's interesting. I think his assistant talking about how he has developed as a manager. He's very, very good tactically, Arteta. He's learned a lot from Pep, but also he's very intelligent himself. The one thing he has had to develop at Arsenal is to be able to develop human connections with other people and develop a team environment. And that comes from what we talked about there, having that awareness and being simple in communication also. And if you watch that Arsenal documentary, almost every episode, every game, at the start, in a team talk before kickoff, it's almost Arteta being inventive every single time to be aware of what the emotions are within the room and try and manipulate that in some way. Different stories, different ideas, telling them to the players to try and get a reaction out of them. It's because with that emotional intelligence, it gives you a trait which I think is really a very important one to have as a coach, as a manager. It's the ability to get under the skin of the people that are working for you, to say little things that can really get to them, to motivate them to do what they want to do. If I was to watch my dad, if I go to him and watch him at the training ground, that's exactly what he would do. It's all a part of the banter of the environment and picking fun at people. But he'd say things that really, hit at something that is true to a player. Not in a serious way that will upset them, but in a way that would make them realise that that's true. Get under their skin a little bit and think, oh, I've got to work on that. I've got to do that thing because the manager's pointed me out on it. That emotional intelligence, that manipulation of emotion, is the difference between telling someone to want to play and doing the right little things to ultimately make that player motivate themselves. Alongside those points that I've made there, my fourth point, my fourth quality of a manager that I think is important is that you should be able to plan for the long term and the short term also. That's actually something my dad said recently, and it's something that stuck with me quite a lot. In management, in football management especially, it's a very high pressure game. And the pressure really is that you have to win the next game. When in reality, as well as winning those games, you have to build the foundations that lead to long-term success also. Just because I've watched it, it's another great example is Arteta and Aubameyang and having the problems with that player, ultimately making a sacrifice, him not being in the team and him ultimately leaving. In the short term, of course, that's not great because they need a striker, they need someone who's going to score goals. But Arteta has that vision on the short term and the long term, and sees that going forward, compromising those values, compromising the rules, allowing players to get away with things and do that, it will only spread that attitude more and more. It will infect the team, it will infect the club, and ultimately in the long term, results will go down, they'll go down in the league, and ultimately Arteta will get sacked. To be able to see and plan for that, that allows for a manager to survive longer within a club and to thrive in that also. But that comes from handling pressure, and that is ultimately what a good manager does, handles the pressure, thrives in the pressure of a situation, and within everything that is going on, can plan for what is happening now, but can also look to the future also. Go back to Wayne Rooney, I think he was someone at Derby at the time, he could handle the pressure of the situation in that moment. He could just work on what needed to be worked on. And that is a fantastic trait to have as a manager, to really, when we talk about thinking long-term and short-term, it's about thinking clearly and planning logically in very emotional situations. The fifth and final thing that I think a manager should have, and a manager should understand really, is that it is always their fault. This is another thing that comes from my dad, and it's something that's made me think quite a lot. When it comes to management and football management, it's not a job that anyone should really want. It's an absolute nightmare of a job. The pressure of it is unbelievable. And when everything goes wrong, it is absolutely your fault all of the time. The psychologist's job is great because when it's going well, oh great, you've done a fantastic job there. But when it's going wrong, you can kind of just sneak into the shadows a little bit. So it's ultimately, you're never really held that much responsible in any job really, but in management, absolutely. When it's going well, that's fantastic, but for the most part, it's going to go wrong, and when it does, it is your fault. That's not just people thinking that it is, it also literally is your fault. You are responsible for everything. And when it comes to people performing on the pitch, if they're not good enough, if they're not doing the things that you want them to do, that's not the player's fault. That's your fault as a manager, as a coach. It all feeds back into you as a manager. Going back to Arteta and Pep as well, when I see them in the changing rooms talking to the players, they are always willing to say, it is my fault. It's my responsibility. Arteta saying, I'll go out there in front of the cameras and take responsibility and protect you as players. That is ultimately the job of the manager. At its core, it's really a very selfless job to have. At least in the sense that you should be selfless in it. And that is the best way to do it, to care and protect for your players, to take responsibility for their failings and ultimately let them have responsibility for their success. But also as a manager, if you can say, that's my fault, when you lose that job and you say, that's my fault, I didn't do those things, it means you can reflect, it means you can learn, it means you don't avoid things that are happening, and you ultimately get better as a manager. If you constantly put that blame on everybody else, and to be fair, this applies to any job really, you ultimately just get worse and worse at what you do. And have that, it goes back to awareness again, having that lack of understanding of what you can and cannot do. So to have that acceptance, that to know it's always your fault, everything that happens, it comes back to you and what you have done. A manager really needs to understand that. So yeah, they're really my 5 things, 5 qualities really. If I had to pick 5, they're the things I look for in a manager. So for 1, being consistent. 2, being decisive at all times. Thirdly, having awareness of the people around you and yourself. Number 4, plan long and short term. And also lastly, know that it's always your fault. You know, there's always conversations about managers being great, managers being good, and it's all based on results and winning and everything like that. But there's always so many contributing factors to everything. And I think there's so much that we don't touch on as to what makes a good manager. And it's a lot to do with how they think, how they act, really day in, day out, the minute seconds of a day and how players respond to that. That is what makes a good manager. And it's a lot of what we don't see. It's a lot beyond, it's a lot underneath what we see of that 90 minutes on the pitch. And it's also a lot more than what we see when managers talk in a press conference. I mean, for example, when Ten Hag talks in his press conference, the first one he did, I think he's very much different as a personality than what he is in front of those cameras. So it's really hard to judge what he's like as a person, as a manager, until you're really there in the training ground day to day. And that is the same with every manager really. But yeah, that is the episode for today. Thank you for watching and listening. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are and what actually makes a good manager. Do you agree with the points that I made? Do you disagree with some of them? Do you have points of your own? Am I maybe overvaluing these traits more so than having that tactical understanding? And just tell me if you think I'm wrong. I can take it. If you're listening on Spotify, on Apple, on Google, make sure you leave a review. But on YouTube also leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already. I can't believe, how can you not subscribe? But yeah, thank you for watching and listening. Good luck on FPL game week 2, and I will see you next week.